Hello, General Biology, and welcome to Chapter 7. And again, we're going to continue with these supplemental notes because I think you're enjoying being able to watch the videos to reinforce what we're talking about. In this chapter, we're going to break this chapter down into two tests, 7.1 and 7.2, and 7.3 and 7.4. 7.1 and 7.2 have the most material in it. There's going to be a lot that you need to learn, to make connections, to be able to synthesize, and of course memorize. So hopefully the way that this is set up will help you to do that. I recommend printing out this outline, and if there's room on the side, adding any additional notes. And one of the things that I'm going to tell you is when I do this particular test, I do not use book definitions. I put things into my own words. So listen to how I am describing things. When it comes to the cells and the organelles in the cells that we'll be talking about, you are responsible to know everything about that organelle. Its function, its location, its appearance, the structure. You'll hear me say structure for appearance. If it's connected to any other organelles, if it's part of transport of proteins. All of this is going to be very, very important for you to know. So, excuse me, this chapter and the way that I test on this is very detailed oriented. All right, so I want you to know that in advance. Okay, so we're going to learn about cell structure and function, and that's what section 7.1 talks about, is the cell structure and the function. Let's watch this fun little video first.
One of the great things about science is that when scientists make a discovery, it's not always in a prescribed manner, as in only in a laboratory under strict settings with white lab coats and all sorts of neat science gizmos that go beep. In reality, the events and people involved in some of the major scientific discoveries are as weird and varied as they get. My case in point, the weird history of the cell theory. There are three parts to the cell theory. 1. All organisms are composed of one or more cells. 2. The cell is the basic unit of structure and organization in organisms. And 3. All cells come from pre-existing cells. To be honest, this all sounds incredibly boring until you dig a little deeper into how the world of microscopic organisms and it all started in the early 1600s in the Netherlands, where a spectacle maker named Zacharias Janssen is said to have come up with the first compound microscope, along with the first telescope. Both claims are often disputed, as apparently he wasn't the only bored guy with a ton of glass lenses to play with at the time. Despite this, the microscope soon became a hot item that every naturalist or scientist at the time wanted to play with, making it much like the iPad of its day. One such person was a fellow Dutchman by the name of Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who heard about these microscope doohickeys, and instead of going out and buying one, he decided to make his own. And it was a strange little contraption indeed, as it looked more like a tiny paddle the size of a sunglass lens. If he had stuck two together, it probably would have made a wicked set of sunglasses that you couldn't see much out of. Anywho, once Leeuwenhoek had his microscope ready, he went to town looking at anything and everything he could with them, including the gunk on his teeth. Yes, you heard right. He actually discovered bacteria by looking at dental scrapings, which, when you keep in mind that people didn't brush their teeth much, if at all, back then, he must have had a lovely bunch of bacteria to look at. When he wrote about his discovery, he didn't call them bacteria as we know them today, but he called them animalcules because they looked like little animals to him. While Leeuwenhoek was staring at his teeth gunk, he was also sending letters to a scientific colleague in England by the name of Robert Hooke. Hooke was a guy who really loved all aspects of science, so he dabbled in a little bit of everything, including physics, chemistry, and biology. Thus it is Hooke who we can thank for the term the cell, as he was looking at a piece of cork under his microscope, and the little chambers he saw reminded him of cells, or the rooms monks slept in their monasteries. Think college dorm rooms, but without the TVs, computers, and really annoying roommates. Hooke was something of an underappreciated scientist of his day, something he brought upon himself as he made the mistake of locking horns with one of the most famous scientists ever, Sir Isaac Newton. Remember when I said Hooke dabbled in many different fields? Well, after Newton published a groundbreaking book on how planets move due to gravity, Hooke made the claim that Newton had been inspired by Hooke's work in physics. Newton, to say the least, did not like that, which sparked a tense relationship between the two that lasted even after Hooke died, as quite a bit of Hooke's research, as well as his only portrait, was misplaced due to Newton. Much of it was rediscovered, thankfully, after Newton's time, but not his portrait, as sadly no one knows what Robert Hooke looked like. Fast forward to the 1800s, where two German scientists discovered something that today we might find rather obvious, but helped tie together what we now know as the cell theory. The first scientist was Matthias Schleiden, a botanist who liked to study plants under a microscope. From his years of studying different plant species, it finally dawned on him that every single plant he had looked at were all made of cells. At the same time, on the other end of Germany was Theodor Schwann, a scientist who not only studied slides of animal cells under the microscope and got a special type of nerve cell named after him, but also invented rebreathers for firefighters and had a kickin' pair of sideburns. After studying animal cells for a while, he too came to the conclusion that all animals were made of cells. Immediately, he reached out via snail mail, as Twitter had yet to be invented, to other scientists working in the same field, and it was Schleiden who got back to him, and the two started working on the beginnings of the cell theory. A bone of contention arose between them, as for the last part of the cell theory, that cells come from pre-existing cells, Schleiden didn't exactly subscribe to that thought, as he swore cells came from free cell formation, where they just kind of spontaneously crystallized into existence. That's when another scientist, named Rudolf Virchow, stepped in with research showing that cells did come from other cells. Research that was actually, how to put it, borrowed without permission from a Jewish scientist by the name of Robert Remak, which led to two more feuding scientists. Thus, from teeth gunk to torquing off Newton, crystallization to Schwann cells, the cell theory came to be an important part of biology today. Some things we know about science today may seem boring, but how we came to know them is incredibly fascinating. So if something bores you, dig deeper. It's probably got a really weird story behind it somewhere.
Alright, so as you just heard, we wouldn't know about the cell if it hadn't been for the early technological advances of the microscope. And there were several different kinds of microscopes that were developed, but it was Anton van Leeuwenhoek's microscope that we use today as our basis of studying cells. So Leeuwenhoek was a Dutch scientist, and he was a lens maker, and he made the single lens microscope in the 1600s, as you saw from the video. He shared his discovery with a scientist by the name of Robert Hooke, who was able to get his hands on a microscope and was looking at cork cells from the cork of wine bottles. And when he looked at them, he saw these tiny little box-like structures that some say reminded him of either the honeycombs in a bee's nest or the cells at a monastery. No matter which version you go on, he termed the cell, termed the box-like structures the cell based on that. He did not, however, know that there was supposed to be material inside the cells, because cork cells are dead and they do not contain organelles, structures that we're going to talk about. So he had no idea that there were other parts to the cell, but he's been given credit for naming the cell. In 1838 and 1839, there were two other scientists that are important to the formation of the cell theory, and they are Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann. Matthias Schleiden was a botanist, and botanists study plants, and he was researching a variety of different plants and decided that they were all made up of cells. And in the meantime, Schwann, who was a zoologist, was doing the same with animal tissues and decided that all animal tissues were made up of cells. Now, I have a hard time determining who is who, Matthias Schleiden versus Theodor Schwann, so I have a little way of remembering this. When I see Schwann, I think of swan, and a swan is an animal. So Theodor Schwann looked at the animal cells, and then I'll know that Schleiden is the one who looked at plant cells. So that's how I help myself to remember who did what. Together, these two scientists, even though that they were working independently, they came up with the idea that all living things are made up of cells. So the final question of the cell theory is, where do these cells come from? And as you heard, some thought that they just suddenly appeared. But a scientist by the name of Rudolf Virchow, who was a physician, decided to study where cells came from, and he concluded that cells come from pre-existing cells. You have to have cells to produce a cell. So these 5 scientists are responsible for helping to form the cell theory. And the cell theory just states 3 things: that all living things are made up of cells. So no matter what it is, if it's life, cells are the basic unit of that structure of living things. So that's that second part of the theory. Cells are the basic unit and structure of living things. So you can go from unicellular to multicellular, plant or animal. It's going to be made up of cells, and cells will be the basic way that those living things will function. And then finally, the third part is that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So these are the 3 parts of the cell theory. Now I know, because you're so smart, you're saying, Mrs. Saunders, you taught us earlier in the year that a theory means that it's a well-tested explanation, but there might be some loopholes that we don't know, and that's right. We feel we haven't discovered everything, so because of that, we don't know if everything is made up of cells, but so far, everything on Earth we know is made up of cells that we have discovered. Okay? All right, I'm going to end this screencast here because we've got some videos to watch for the next, and I'll see you in the next screencast.